Hey, 42 here. Life is like a box of chocolates. It's far too expensive and I only enjoy about 50% of it. But when it comes down to it, what on earth or anywhere else is life? From our perspective, water and rocks and spoons and slippers are all inanimate objects. But how do we decide what is alive and what is not? Is there a point where the chemistry suddenly crosses over? Would we recognise an alien species if we saw it? And if you really believe hard enough, can you bring something to life? When you're trying to define life, you realise that it can't be black and white. It's like asking how many trees do you need to make a forest? What's the point where a snack becomes a meal? And how many cats must you own before you have a problem? There is no one criteria that we can use to define life. And we also must remember that we have an obvious tendency to focus on our planetary carbon-based existence when there are actually countless other worlds that could have created living beings from any other elements, such as silicon or iron. So if we accept that life is a very grey area, then we must focus on key facets to determine if something really is alive. Firstly, complexity. Confucius may have said, life is really simple, but we insist on making it complicated. But then again, he often put his pants on backwards and knew zero about molecular biology. Also, life needs to practice homeostasis, meaning that it has an equilibrium for its internal conditions, things like temperature, pH value, glucose levels, etc. So, what about life on Earth? What piece of chemical creativity created the winding path from molecule to monkey to man? Well, about 4 billion years ago, chemistry became complicated and reactive enough to start what we think of as life. The very surprising thing is, this is not the most important nor most improbable event. You could easily get some form of life if you had a planet with a similar chemistry and conditions to ours. And there are most certainly plenty of these planets out there in the universe. But on Earth, once we had life, it just sat around as prokaryotes, a very simple form of cell, with no nucleus or other complicated structures inside it. As these basic cells, they couldn't really change, as it was almost impossible to take in enough energy to make any major upgrades. It would be like trying to install PS4 games on a Game Boy. You'd need a whole room just for the AA batteries. So they stayed like that, just little dribbling morons, for about 2 billion years. Then, a very unlikely thing happened, according to one theory. Archaea are one of the simple cell types that still exist today in some extreme environments. 2 billion years ago, an archaea let a bacterium inside it, possibly through a hole in its cell wall, and, against all odds, both survived. The bacteria became what we know as mitochondria. The reason this was so important is that these mitochondria have an electric charge, which for their size is like a lightning bolt. It was only once they had this new pimped out engine that cells had the energy to become more complex and spawn all the life that we see around us today. Except squirrels. No one knows where squirrels are from. Part of the reason behind this mitochondria theory is that every living thing shares almost 50% of the same DNA with Archaea, a 2 billion year old cell. Alright then, so if we have a very good guess at how life actually began, is there anything we can do to replicate it and start a game of cellular Sims in a petri dish? Well, we're actually not too far off getting life started. At NASA's Ames Research Center in California, they set up the best space-like conditions that they could by turning the lights off and cranking up the air conditioning. Well, to put it in simple terms anyway. They then took commonly occurring molecules of carbon and nitrogen and exposed them to radiation, managing to produce 3 key chemicals that are needed for RNA and DNA, showing that it's possible that the components of life could have come in on an asteroid in the early stages of our planet's development. Okay, but a bit of space chemistry is hardly exciting. What about real Frankenstein cells that we can put together from bits of leftover lunch? Well, Dr. Craig Venter, a pioneer in genetics, spent 15 years along with his team sequencing the DNA of a bacterium and then artificially reproducing it, along with a watermark so that they could track it. They chose Mycoplasma genitalium, the smallest bacteria in the world, and they injected their code into an empty cell after working out how to get rid of its original DNA. These new artificial cells successfully reproduce, showing that the process actually works. But we still don't really understand these genitalium, so basically we've created life, but we're not quite sure how. This bacterium has under 500 genes, whereas humans have 20,000. And of the 500 or so, we're not sure what a quarter of them actually do, aside from the fact that they are very necessary. Making life is one thing, but controlling it is a whole other step, so it'll be a while before you can pop down the pet store and order up a monkey with lizard eyes and bat wings. Finally, let's leave boring old reality behind and have a quick wander into the hypothetical. We're made of carbon, but what other kinds of materials could create life? And what conditions would they need to exist? Silicon is probably the most likely candidate, since it can create molecules that are large enough to carry the massive amount of information you need to encode a life form. What's more, we already have a hint at its existence here on Earth, since a type of algae called diatoms have a cell wall made up of silica. Just don't tell too many people, or carbon-free dieting will become a thing. Vadim N. Sisovic has proposed a possible space-borne life form in the form of dust suspended in plasma. In certain extraterrestrial conditions, the dust could become charged and begin to self-organize into complicated structures. And from there, who knows what the dust could evolve into? Presumably some kind of dust monster. All in all, you are unbelievably lucky to be alive. It's not just a peculiar combination of genes that makes you, you, but the overwhelming amount of chance and good fortune that got us from little dots in a vast molecular soup to big, fat, walking, talking land monkeys. Thanks for the view, subscribe for more. 42. But there's a man equally as despicable as Adolf Hitler, yet very few people even know of his existence. The humble caterpillar is one of the most mind-shatteringly incredulous creatures on planet Earth.